A recently published study showed greater weight loss with an app-based ketogenic diet approach compared to Weight Watchers approach. And it wasn't even close. It was quite significant with the keto group losing 8.3 kilograms in 24 weeks versus only 2.8 kilograms in Weight Watchers. So does this prove low carb is better? Does this prove that there's a metabolic advantage to eating low carb? Well, I'm going to give you my perspective, and we're going to hear from one of the authors, Dr. Ethan Weiss. I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director of DietDoctor.com, and it's actually a pleasure to be able to talk to Dr. Weiss about this. But first, let's talk about the trial a little bit. So I'll give you some of those perspectives. First, it was published in obesity, and they had 155 patients who are overweight with a body mass index between 27 and 43. And this was a completely app-based trial. There was very little, if any, human interaction. And we'll hear Dr. Weiss talk about that as well. And they were randomized to the standard Weight Watchers, the app-based Weight Watchers approach, counting your calories, assigning point values, or they were assigned to a keto, K-E-Y-T-O, which is the brand which Dr. Weiss is a co-founder in, to be clear, to their program with their breath sensor. And what they did was they followed them for 48 weeks. And so we're going to eventually get the 48-week data. But so far we have the 12 and the 24-week data. And at 12 weeks, the people following the low-carb keto app lost 5.6 kilograms, whereas Weight Watchers, they lost 2.5 kilograms. And at 24 weeks, it was 8.3 kilograms for the low carb versus 2.8 kilograms for Weight Watchers. So significant difference. And those following the low carb approach improved their hemoglobin A1C and liver function test, ALT, whereas the Weight Watchers group did not. Now, here's the other interesting thing. Both groups reduced their calories, and statistically, they reduced it to the same amount. But it was self-reported data, as you're going to hear Dr. Weiss talk about, that maybe that's an issue. But if you take it at face value that they ate the same amount of calories with significant difference in weight loss, that speaks to a metabolic advantage for low-carb nutrition, meaning there's something about eating low carb that helps you lose more weight. And that's part of the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that we've talked to Dr. David Ludwig about, and of course others. And there is some evidence to support that, but it's not universally accepted. There's lots of controversy about it. So what are some of the other potential explanations? Well, we're going to hear Dr. Weiss's theory that maybe it has to do with the poor quality of self-reported data, which is hard to argue with, but why would it be one instead of the other? So we'll hear what he has to say about that. But basically, I think this was a big victory for science, right? It was a randomized controlled trial. It was app-based. It was not very expensive to run. It didn't require a lot of human intervention, and it showed a significant difference measuring weight loss, hemoglobin, and A1C. It was impactful on the lives of these people, and it contributes to the body of evidence. Now, it's not a mechanistic study, right? We can have mechanistic studies, which are highly controlled studies in metabolic wards. They have their own problem. Compliance doesn't factor in because everything's provided. Time frame is very short. So if something takes longer to adjust, like to a low-carb diet adaptation, you might be missing that or not measuring it. But the positives of this, it's a real life study. I mean, this is something any dietitian, any physician, any health coach can do. Just put somebody on a ketogenic diet, give them the advice to do it, and maybe give them some support with an app or even like a website like DietDoctor.com where they can get the information and get started and then not have so much hands-on intervention. That's the real world study. And this showed good compliance and good outcomes. So pretty impressive study. But now the most exciting, let's hear what Dr. Weiss has to say about this study since he was involved and knows the literature well. All right, well, Dr. Weiss, thanks for coming back on to talk about this exciting new study that you just have published.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Brett.
Yeah, so congratulations on the study. Very, very interesting study in so many different ways. And I think the first one to talk about was this study really had very little human interaction. It was just all over an app, all remote, and it was designed that way even before COVID. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say we got lucky or, I don't know. I don't think we were that smart. We probably just got lucky.
Yeah, which is actually a really good point, because when you talk about lifestyle intervention studies, the big question is who's funding it, because pharmaceutical companies aren't funding it. So you kind of do have to do these studies on the cheap. You're almost at like a disadvantage, right?
That's right. This study, just so to be clear and transparent, this study was funded, it was funded jointly by this company that I co-founded and advised called Keto Health and then also by the Canadian government. The Canadian government has a spectacular program for funding industry-sponsored research for Canadian scientists. So,
well, it's a whole nother topic we can get into about how the U.S. can learn from that. Maybe that's
yeah.
another topic we'll discuss. But let's get into some of the details of the study. So basically using the app that you helped fund the company, the Keto app, or using the Weight Watchers app, and really no other advice, no other intervention, or was there?
Very light. I mean, there was an onboarding call that everybody got, but very little yeah, I mean, I think there might have been I actually don't even know what was available to people in the Weight Watchers app. I think we did pay for their version of premium, which would have allowed them to chat with a coach if they wanted to, but we don't have any way of tracking that. And on the keto side, there were like 1 or 2 chats and that was it.
Okay. So yeah, really hands off.
Yep.
and just saying, here's the advice, go for it. And some pretty dramatic results. I mean, at 12 weeks, the people on the keto app had lost 5.6 kilograms versus 2.5 on Weight Watchers. So right away, at 12 weeks, pretty significant benefit. But then at 24 weeks, it continued to improve on the keto app. They lost 8.3 kilograms, and the Weight Watchers really kind of stalled at 2.8 kilograms. So I guess my first question is, were you surprised to see this, or did you think all along that was your hypothesis?
No, we were surprised. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we had an idea that a low carb intervention might have advantages for weight loss over sort of more conventional low fat, diet approach, like a Weight Watchers approach. But we didn't know if people were going to be able to do this on their own. And I think that was sort of one of the big questions that we sought to answer.
Yeah. So, there's this big debate about low carb diets. Does it provide a metabolic advantage beyond other diets, or is it simply because it helps you reduce calories more? And one interpretation of your study could be, well, look, the calorie consumption was roughly the same between the 2 diet groups. So therefore, it must be a metabolic advantage. That's one interpretation, but I don't think that's your interpretation from what I've seen. So I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so this is definitely one of the most interesting and I think thought-stimulating parts of the results that we got, which is, as you say, the self-reported analysis that we did of calorie intake, energy intake over the course of the study showed that there was no difference, or if anything, people randomized to the keto intervention ate more or said they ate more. And yes, you can interpret that at least 2 ways, probably a lot more. One simple way is, yeah, there's a metabolic advantage to doing this and that they end up burning more calories. I think that's possible. I can't prove that it's not. I just happen, if I were to be betting, I would bet that it's something else. And I think I love having, sort of interesting conversations where we get to debate things, especially when no one knows the answer. And so I, sort of intentionally threw this out there that I had a hunch that it might be something else.
Well, you're going to keep us in suspense? What are your something else
no, I don't
theories?
think, I mean, again, I think, we can argue or discuss forever and ever about the sort of how do you lose weight? How do you gain weight? Is it purely just an increase in calories? Are we just glorified automobiles? Or is there something else? And I guess, from the way I look at this, I guess ultimately, this is going to sound kind of bad, don't really care because it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, people lost an enormous amount of weight and they were able to do so relatively easily. And it was really a tremendous amount of weight relative to the control. And, again, this was not just control diet as usual or hand somebody a pamphlet and pat them on the back. This was an active, well-known, well-vetted consumer weight loss program. So it is really important that we've decided to randomize not to just control or placebo or nothing. We did a randomized trial against a real control arm, a real active control arm. So, I think how and why this worked the way it worked is fascinating. Again, my hunch is, and it's just a hunch, is that people doing this low carb intervention felt like they were more full. And there has been some work to show that people doing low carb nutrition do have sort of well, 2 things. One is they do feel more full when calorie restricted. That's an important distinction from the work that Kevin Hall just published which is a very different context where people they were not losing weight and they were not calorie restricted. And then the other thing that's interesting is that, and this has also worked from Kevin's group, is that people doing low carb interventions tend to over-report how much they eat, meaning they say they eat more than they did. And my guess, and it's just a guess, or I should say it's just a informed guess, is that that's because they feel more full. They're not as hungry. So if you're not as hungry, you think, well, I must have eaten more. So my guess is that they actually did not eat the same number of calories, that if we had a way of tracking actually what they did eat, that we would see that they ate a lot more than they thought they did, or sorry, a lot less than they thought they did.
Yeah, a couple really good points there. And that last one you made, that's the difference between here's your advice and go kind of trial versus let's put you in the metabolic ward and measure everything you eat kind of trial. And the metabolic ward is good for physiology as long as you give it enough time and measure the right variables. And the here you go, good luck trial is very good for the clinician out there to know how their patients are going to respond. So this type of trial, like you said, who cares why it works? It works. Docs go use it. Nutritionists go use it. That could certainly be one interpretation. But the other really important thing you brought up is that there's an active control arm. And I think that's so important because so many of these trials show X diet works better than the standard American diet. Well, what isn't going to work better than the standard American diet is a common retort. So having the active arm is really important here, and not exactly a good advertisement for Weight Watchers. That's for sure, huh?
Well, I mean, you know what you get with Weight Watchers. This is part of the reason we chose them. There's a tremendous wealth of published results using Weight Watchers in different randomized nutrition trials. So the amount of weight that we saw in our participants at 12 and 16 weeks, 12 and 24 weeks was relatively close to what the average weight loss is in all the published trials. So I don't think, again, I'm not intentionally trying to troll Weight Watchers. I think you know what you get with Weight Watchers. So we knew roughly what we were going to get. About, over 12 weeks, you get about 3 kilograms. And so we knew that was the bar. And honestly, when we were designing the study, in our heads, even though we didn't design it this way, it was really, to me, an inferiority trial, right? Like, could you actually, non-inferiority trial, could you actually show that you could do as well? Again, we didn't design it that way. We designed it as a superiority trial, but I wasn't expecting to do as well as we did. I think we were all surprised.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And also, let's talk about the carbohydrates, because the sort of like the design of the intervention was to use the breath meter to titrate your amount of carbohydrates to stay in like the moderate level, which according to the breath meter was like a 4 or above. But even with that intervention and using the breath meter 3 times per day, the carb reduction wasn't of the 30 grams per day like we see in a lot of the ketogenic trials. It was 90 grams per day. So were you also surprised by that data?
Well, yes and no. Again, it all comes back to how much weight you put into these self-reported nutrition surveys. And this goes back to what I was saying before. I think they're notoriously pretty dirty. And we all know that, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. People are terrible at reporting what they eat. So you could say, well, why didn't we do it? We didn't do it for treat. And we didn't do it because we were like, what's the point? It's a random number generator. Here we were actually interested in trying to compare the difference between the two groups. I'm really happy we did it. I don't think people ate 90 grams of carbohydrate a day. I don't think they ate 30 though. I think they probably ate more. Importantly, we don't really know, but my guess is they ate a lot more than 30 and a lot less than 90.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it brings up a lot of the frustrations with self-reported data for all those trials that are out there. I mean, you kind of do have to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, it's the best guess that we sort of have, or they have, but it's likely not accurate. So do you think there's utility at all for a study like this to start talking about mechanisms, to start talking about physiology, or don't even scratch the surface? Just keep it as a pure practical trial.
I mean, you can interpret it however you want to interpret it. I sort of think, look, let's, if you want to be a purist, you'll think about it in the context of what was our primary endpoint, what were some of the secondaries, and stick to that. If you're curious and inquisitive and you can frame it correctly and not over-interpret it and sort of index on what it all means, I think it's fun to speculate about what's going on. So I love, especially because it could be a launching point for future studies. So I don't mind at all. I think it's great that people dig in and try and think a little bit about what all this stuff means. And there are lots of interesting questions. And by the way, like lots more to come, including the 1 year data, which should be out sometime, late fall or early next year. And then lots of different sort of sub-analyses. Again, nothing that we would, sort of make primary, this is going to end up in a major journal, but some really interesting exploratory things that we're doing, trying to understand sort of how did this work and what are the behavioral implications and what is the impact of this device? Does this device actually do anything? What predicts success?
Right. It would be interesting to see the app use without the device versus the app use with the device, to see that feedback, that constant feedback, and how much that helps with compliance. Because at the 1 year data, it seems like it's a foregone conclusion. It's going to be better as long as they remain compliant, I would think, right? So it's more of a compliance measure almost at that point. So that will be interesting to see.
I think so. I mean, I guess, just to be totally transparent, I'm not sure how much the device will matter at 1 year. I think the device is probably really important early on as a learning tool and as in reinforcing some of these behaviors. I think by 6 months and definitely by 1 year, that at least in my own experience and talking to people of mine who've done this before, friends of mine who've done this before, that it's pretty well baked at that point. Like, you don't need a lot of the information you're getting from the device.
Yeah, that's a good point. It can be very helpful feedback in the beginning as you learn the tools and techniques and the behaviors and the recipes and whatnot. But then once you get it ironed out, not as important. Yeah. Well, some of the other interesting data was the hemoglobin A1C went down in the keto group, but not the Weight Watchers group. ALT, measure of liver function, improved in the keto group, but not the Weight Watchers group. Do you think that was a factor of weight loss pure and simple, or do you think, again, brainstorming potential hypothesis mechanisms, did the carb reduction have something to do with that in addition to weight loss?
Yeah, this one we did actually explore in the manuscript. And I think you raise a great point, right? So we all know that weight loss will improve those metabolic markers like hemoglobin A1C or, ALT, which is a marker of metabolic liver disease. I think the advantage of doing an active comparator is that we had weight loss in the control group or in the other group. You can't even call it a control group, right? It's not really in the other group. And so we were able to do some very exploratory analyses to ask that very important question is, were these changes in metabolic markers all due to weight loss or were they due to potentially something else? And so we went back and the graduate student who led this work is a incredibly talented young woman whose first name is Kaya, and I can't pronounce her last name for the life of me because it's like Volcanian, but it's some German name. And she works in the lab of John Little, and John's a phenomenally talented young scientist in Kelowna, British Columbia, who was the PI on this study. So I wasn't the PI. And Kaya went back and did an analysis where she basically adjusted for weight loss and then looked to see what the impact was on changes in hemoglobin A1C and on ALT specifically. And she saw that those changes remained significantly different between the two groups, even when you adjust for the amount of weight lost. So it does give us a hint that there may well be something else going on, which, by the way, it doesn't take a mathematician or a statistician to know. As you said, there was no change in hemoglobin A1C in the Weight Watchers group, despite the fact that they lost 3 kilograms or so of weight. So I think it starts to tell you that there is probably here something special and different about the diet.
Yeah, I guess the counter argument would be that there's some threshold level that you have to get above. But again, some threshold level of weight loss to get above to see the metabolic benefits. But again, it's hypothesis. I guess we don't know that for sure.
Maybe so. We didn't obviously publish this, but I've been able to kind of dig in and do a deep dive on all the individual level data. And, we've looked specifically at each person in the trial. And so we've graphed people by how much weight that they, sort of done before and after. And I will tell you, at least as far as I can see, there's no threshold. Because there were some people, if you look at the waterfall plots in the Weight Watchers group, who lost a significant amount of weight. I don't remember the max, but they did lose a significant amount of weight. But it doesn't appear that led to the same or even close to the same improvements in these metabolic markers.
Yeah, I think that's the most interesting data for the metabolic benefit of the carb reduction, that you can compare those who had the biggest response. And those waterfall plots are fascinating when you look at the study. I mean, really the inflection point is really just shifted so far over for the keto group, but there's some on both sides, as there are for any trial. Yeah, so I thought that was a good visual representation. I recommend people take a look at that. Yeah, so what do you think this adds to the literature for low carb intervention. Low carb intervention, I guess. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, so I think we've talked about a couple of the things. We've talked about sort of this was mostly or almost actually entirely mobile delivered during a pandemic, which is pretty amazing, right? I mean, we started enrollment for this trial in, I believe, either late December, early January of 2020. And we were peak enrolling in March, April, May of 2020 during lockdown. And so people were able to do it. We were able to replace a lot of the human intervention that you find in a program like Virta, right? I mean, Virta is a very human-heavy intervention. We were able to see results that were not that far off from what they've published. Now, they've not done a randomized trial. They've done single-arm studies or, against some sort of usual care. Obviously, a different population of people. They do have a smaller group of people with prediabetes, but we were able to deliver a pretty robust result without that human component. And so that's one. Number two, I think, we talked a little bit about the sort of question about the relative impact of, or the question about calories versus, metabolic benefit. I think that's interesting. Number three, we've talked about these metabolic benefits themselves, so the hemoglobin A1C and the ALT. The only thing that we haven't talked about, the other kind of key take home that I had as a cardiologist that you're going to know before I even say it, is that we had designed this study specifically to try to offset some of the reported effects of low carbohydrate diets on lipids. And so we designed a diet that was sort of emphasizing mono and polyunsaturated fats and sort of emphasizing less saturated fat, particularly from animals. And so our program was sort of designed to ask the question, can you do this diet, get all the benefits, and not see any of the changes in the lipids that concern, me, and I won't speak for you, but concern, let's say, most cardiologists. And so that was exciting, even though it was a negative result. There was no change, no difference, statistical difference in the lipids between the two groups. So again, it shows that you can kind of get all of this good stuff. And the one thing that sort of has always kept me up at night is, are we creating a mess with these lipids? And again, we just didn't see it.
Yeah, and that part I find so interesting because I wonder, like, you and I come from a very different perspective, I think, because we don't see patients who start a keto diet and have perfectly normal LDL. They just don't come to see us. We kind of only see the ones where they have their LDL goes to the roof and nobody knows what to do. So they send them to a cardiologist, and a cardiologist who's aware of a keto diet. So I think we certainly have a referral bias based on that. But when you look at the data, certainly the Virta Health data and some meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials of low-carb studies, in patients who are obese or have type 2 diabetes, the majority of them don't have the LDL rise. Most of those studies show that on average, the LDL or ApoB does not go up. So I'm wondering if that really is a problem that needs to be addressed in the literature in that patient population.
Okay, great point and great question. I think and it's a little bit hard because, it's a mishmash of studies, as you say. I think the Virta data is probably the cleanest data set. A little bit of a different patient population because they're mostly patients with type 2 diabetes, and ours didn't have that. But if I recall correctly, and I haven't looked at it in a long time, there was about a 10% increase in LDL cholesterol in the Virta study, at least at 1 year. About
there was a 10% LDL increase without an increase in ApoB, interestingly.
Yeah, which is interesting. And again, I'm not sure that matters, but I mean, I think, as you know, I'm an ApoB guy, so I was comforted by that. So on average, and I don't have access to the individual data in the Virta trial, but we don't know if there were some individuals who had, substantial rises. But on average, there was sort of this modest increase in LDL, and as you say, no change in ApoB, which is comforting. We didn't see any change in LDL or ApoB or anything. And actually, I do have access to individual level data, and we've plotted them. And there were really no what anyone would call hyper responders here. So no one's LDL. So a few people did have increases in LDL cholesterol, but nothing. I don't think anyone ended up over. I'm just making this up, but I don't think anyone ended up over 190. I mean, I'm comfortable, I think, saying that. I don't think anyone ended up over 190. And the majority of people stayed the same or went down. So
it'd be interesting to test this in people who are hyper responders. have half of them
Yes.
keep doing what they're doing and switch half
Yes.
of them.
Yes.
Any plans for that in the future?
I'd love to do that. It's on a short list of studies that we hope to do. I think it would be really fun. I have an anecdotal experience. I'm sure you do too, of playing around with,
Yeah.
as you say, patients who come to me with this problem and how to fix it. And obviously, there are multiple ways to do that, including making changes in their nutrition, but also, potentially adding medicines. Anecdotally, I've had a lot of success with doing that, fat swap of increasing the mono and polyunsaturated fats and reducing saturated fat. But that's not a study. But overall, I think it was a comfort, sort of really well done. And I'm patting John on the back, not necessarily us, but a well done study, relatively decent length of time. We'll see the 1 year data and active comparator. And, again, nothing here that screams to people out there who are really worried about cholesterol. There's nothing here that says this is something to worry about. I think we can say you can do this. And that one concern that sort of lingers in a lot of mainstream doctors and cardiologists' mind is what's the impact on lipids. We can say pretty safely, look, you can get this benefit, but you're not going to see that problem.
Yeah, such a great point. I mean, so many people are hesitant to recommend a low carb or keto diet simply because of the what ifs. And this study shows you can do it without any what ifs, really. And that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I guess formally we don't have outcomes, but it is, no one does in any of these studies. So all the markers, the surrogates, all go in the right direction. I mean, I used to say when I advised Virta back in the day, I used to say, look, you get 35 markers and 34 of them go in the right direction and one doesn't. I think here we can say we get all of them going in the right direction.
Great. Well, congratulations for you and your team for getting this out there, and thank you for contributing to quality studies in the field of ketosis and carbohydrate reduction. And I look for more from you in the future. It's good. I think we got, like I said, we got more coming. It'll be fun to see what everything looks like, and I'm glad people are interested. Very good. All right. Thanks again.